How often do we not see debates raging between religious people who would claim that there is an absolute morality handed down to us by their God, and then they argue the only alternative is a free-for-all where everybody just does what they please. And I'm going to argue against that. Now then, if you have a subjective morality, so to speak, does that mean everybody can just make up their own mind about what is moral and what isn't? No, it doesn't. And I'll explain why. Morality in a world that is not ruled by God, which is basically reality, morality is something that is created by humans themselves. And how is it created? Well, ultimately, as a kind of ultimate cause, there is of course the genes instructing our bodies on how to procreate, and part of that set of instructions is a set of instructions that govern how we behave toward each other. And you might think, of course, that with genes being selfish as they are, that one would just become completely selfish and basically go around clubbing each other over the head. But the problem is that doesn't work. That doesn't ensure the gene's survival as well as certain modes of cooperation actually achieve. And that is something that a lot of people do not understand. I think the best thing you can do in order to come to grips with this is to investigate a little bit in something called game theory that explains why under many circumstances a tactic of cooperation can be more successful as a tactic of predatory taking advantage all the time. So look into that. What you also need to understand is that we do not feel our genes' motivation. Our genes instruct our bodies to behave in certain ways. But in order for us to be compelled to behave in such ways, it has to feel right. Otherwise you wouldn't do it. And that leads to something that a lot of religious people, and I'm being very sarcastic here, because I know some people will not get this, a lot of religious people will not be familiar with this, and it's called empathy. It is the ability to put yourself in another person's position and imagine what it would be like to be at the receiving end of your behavior. And that has a very peculiar effect, because that makes you feel bad about your behavior, and then you would be inclined not to engage in that behavior. And it is not just a question of knowing that you won't be getting away with it. It's not just that, it is deeper than that. Real empathy, and if you experience real empathy, you are not concerned with whether you're going to get away with it or not. It just makes you feel bad to treat somebody else badly. Ultimately, the behavior that doesn't make you feel bad will be more likely to ensure your gene's survival. And that is, of course, how the genes selfishly instruct you to behave like that. But still, it makes you morally do the right thing. Having said that, you can start understanding why there are certain moral behaviors that feel kind of universal. For example, behavior that stops people, normal people in any case, from going around clubbing each other to death over the heads. It is just so disruptive to society, and ultimately to the survival of genes, that the genes that coded for retaliation against that and that coded for inhibiting that behavior were much more successful than the genes that allowed that behavior to just rampage on completely uninhibitedly. So that explains already certain types of universal morality. But then there are other types of morality that often seem to us to be self-evident and logical, or not even logical, but you know, that we don't tend to question them, we tend to accept them as moral behavior, and then suddenly there's a sea change and everything changes, and suddenly something else becomes, or something different becomes morally acceptable. For example, in our Western societies, in countries like Ireland, for example, where up until recently it was almost unheard of for people to live together without being married, or to have children without being married. And that was really frowned upon, and it was morally considered to be really, really bad. Now, people wouldn't blink an eye if that happened. The current debates that are raging about gay marriage, for example, is a good example of this. We are in the middle of such a sea change. And what may be going on there? Well, this is what I think is going on. You see, morality is a matter of feedback. This is something that I keep coming back to on all sorts of areas, is feedback. We are organisms that interact with our environment. And our environment are, amongst a lot of other things, other organisms, and specifically other human beings in our society. So, every time we behave in a certain way, society as a whole feeds it back to us by a response. And therefore, we get this loop going on between ourselves and society in how we behave and how society responds. That is essentially a chaotic behavior. Look up chaos theory. It's chaotic. And in chaos, you tend to get what are called attractors. And that is what I think is going on. Morality tends to find itself, morality as a kind of social thing, a social morality that is part of a society, tends to converge on an attractor. And then, like usually happens in these cases, it sort of gets stuck around that attractor and seems to be stable. But ultimately, it is a chaotic thing, and there come points where the behavior can suddenly flick, and that is when you see these paradigm shifts in the morals of society. That is what I think dictates morality. And what can we conclude from that is that A, we can accept that there are certain parts of morality that we can almost treat as if they're absolute or universal. There are certain other parts of morality that are very stable, and that for very short periods in time, decades maybe, or human lifespans, can be treated as absolute. But that can change over time, and if you're living through a cultural change like that, you need to adapt. And then there are certain even lower level moral things that very small groups of people attribute to themselves, or impose on themselves, and that outside those groups nobody will agree with, and that you have to be even more flexible about. So, no, morality is not absolute. Of course it can't be, not in a world where there is no God that hands down morality. But morality can be universal, and morality can be stable even if it's not completely universal, can be stable for long periods of time and feel as if it is universal. And that is something that a lot of religious people don't realize when they consider the rejection of absolute morality. They consider a completely random free-for-all where everybody just does what the bloody hell they please. And of course it isn't.